Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today, we're going to be talking about some of the causes of violence in the United States and around the world. My guest is an expert on this topic. Dr. Joe Young is a professor at the University of Kentucky and director of the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at UK in Lexington, Kentucky. Previously, he held several positions at American University. Dr. Joe Young, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Oh, thanks for having me, Bill.
I appreciate you being with me. Let's, for a moment, just focus on the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce. We had a governor years ago, Governor Ned Breathitt, who said the Patterson School was one of our best kept secrets in the state of Kentucky as far as being a foreign relations school, and we don't want to keep it that way. So what exactly does the Patterson School do?
Well, it's a professional program, a master's program for graduate students. And we train everybody, Kentuckians and everyone around the US and world in diplomacy and commerce and and security and other international affairs issues. And it's an opportunity to get involved and to, a lot of our folks want to move on to DC, or some want to stay in Kentucky, some want to work in business, some want to be in State Department or FBI. And so if any of those things sound interesting to you, you probably should check out Patterson School.
You're right. And you can do that by going to pattersonschool.uky.edu. And I know personally, anecdotally, that there are many former students at the Patterson School who work for private companies like IBM. They work at the United Nations, they work in the State Department, and in a variety of other capacities to hopefully help us create this more peaceful world. Also, Professor, you've got a very interesting website at www.josephyoung.com that has more information about you and your teachings and also your writings. So hopefully our viewers will go to that. Well, let's get right into it. What are how do you describe or how do you define violence as to what's going on today in the United States and in other parts of the world?
Yeah, well, the good news about someone like me that studies violence is I'll always have a job because there has been a bit of violence in the world. Now, that's kind of the bad news. The good news is, if we think more historically, things aren't more violent than they were in the US, let's say in the 1860s when we had a civil war, or in the 1960s when we had violent events happening almost every day. But we are on a more recent uptick in violence, whether it's targeting of political candidates, the attempted assassination on the former president. This kind of violence is not really what we would expect from a democracy, and it's troubling. Although, again, we put it in historical perspective, it's not beyond the pale, and it's not worse than it's been in our history.
Mm-hmm. And it certainly is. It seems like, though, it's getting worse. It seems that, to me anyway, now I'm just a rank amateur when viewing this, but you're right. We have had violent periods with the Civil War and what have you, but nothing to the degree that we saw on January 6th with the attack on the United States Capitol, have we?
I mean, we've never seen an attack like that on the Capitol. There was an attack on the Capitol in the 60s, not as organized, and was more clandestine. But, I think one of the disappointing pieces of it, although I don't think there was ever a chance that there was going to be an overthrow of the US government or some real major political change. But the disheartening piece of it is there's a significant portion of our society right now who isn't willing to accept the outcome of a free and fair election. And that is kind of the hallmark of democracy. The losing team has to say, okay, fine, we lost. We're not going to be violent. We're going to accept the loss, and then we're going to try again in 4 years or 2 years or whatever the time period. But unfortunately, there are a significant portion of society and that are not respecting that, and that's troubling for democracy.
It certainly is, and that has to be a hallmark of democracy, that you have to accept the elections. And every now and then there are some irregularities, but as with the elections in 2020, it was proven. I think former President Trump had 62 cases before various courts, and it was proven in all of them except one that there were no irregularities enough to change the election at any rate. So it's important that we do follow the rules and the regulations and participate when we lose or when we win, whichever the case might be. Well, let me ask you, this is such an important topic. Do you cooperate or do you ever advise groups like the State Department, the Department of Defense, different ones like that who deal with it on a more global level, I guess is what we could say?
Yeah, I've worked on a couple of different initiatives. I'll just talk about one. I did an impact evaluation down in Colombia, where the U.S. government was trying to increase support for the government of Colombia and take support away from the violent groups like the FARC. And so a team, and I was one of the members of the team, we went down and we evaluated whether these efforts were working. And unfortunately, one of the things about changing people's minds and behavior is that you can't really tell in a couple of years. And we did the evaluation for about 5 years, from 2015 to 2020, right around the time that the Colombian peace deal was going through. And we didn't see much change, sort of positive change. The little positive change we saw, we all felt as researchers, and this was disappointing to USAID, that it was going to take probably decades to see real attitudinal changes where people would start supporting the government and be less inclined towards the rebels. Unfortunately, these things take time.
Now, there's a national consortium for the study of terrorism and responses to terrorism, START, and in the Department of Homeland Security. What exactly is that group?
Well, so there are a couple of what are called centers of excellence, and they're universities that provide grants to other universities to do research on national security issues, especially kind of terrorism and radicalization. And so one was at University of Maryland, that was the START Center. And then the newest one is at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, and that's what's called EnSite. And both of these are really trying to provide evidence-based ways that we can manage and deal with political violence, and especially kind of helping develop reasonable evidence in support of national security issues.
I see. And as you look around the world right now and look at the violence that's taking place, where do you see some of the worst cases? Obviously, the Gaza Strip would have to be one of them. Ukraine probably would have to be another. But where are those and a couple more? And what can we do to help bring your teachings, writings into it to help create a more peaceful environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think you and I are both probably on the same team on this, and that we hope that I'm not a strict pacifist. I can see that there are reasons that we might have to use violence occasionally in the world, but I would prefer that we try and resolve our issues in the international sphere nonviolently, just like we try and resolve our issues domestically nonviolently. And yeah, unfortunately, obviously, we've seen in Gaza a tremendous suffering. That's a really challenging conflict to resolve. It's led to all kinds of we've had protests on our campus at American University, and we had protests in DC, and there's been a lot of unhappiness about it. We've been trying to resolve that conflict for decades, and so I don't think I have a good solution to it, except I know that the way forward is not violent. There has to be a resolution, and that both sides get something. And most political conflicts are, and this is Clausewitz said, right, that the war is just the continuation of politics by other means. And so if we can't resolve our political conflicts in peaceful ways, people will turn to war. And so we have to focus on resolving those underlying issues of conflicts. So we have, like you said, Gaza, we have Ukraine. Those are two places where there's tons of suffering. But there's also a lot of violence happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Bangladesh, in several other places around the world. And there's, whether things are getting better or worse is again kind of looking at a long view versus a short view. There was a book by a professor at Harvard. His name's Steven Pinker, and it was called The Better Angels of Our Nature. And he argued that if you look at the long sweep of history, that we're living in the most nonviolent times in human history. And he pulls out archaeological evidence from prehistoric times that shows people were murdered at roughly 40% rate. People died roughly 40% of the time by murder. So his argument is that, like, we look at the long swath of things and things are getting better. And I don't think he's necessarily wrong. And that's kind of what I was alluding to earlier. But as you noted, I think more recently, if we look in a more recent time period, things are ticking up. And I think a lot of that has to do with what we've been talking about, a decline in kind of democratic values and the view that we can resolve our differences at the ballot box and nonviolently. And and I think that has impacts, like we're saying, all over the world.
You're absolutely right. And we're going to come back in just a moment and talk about your book, Tortured Logic. But you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer, you like our shows and you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a look at this broad issue of violence in the United States and in many other areas of the world. My guest is an expert on this topic. Dr. Joe Young is a professor at the University of Kentucky, and he is the director of the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce in Lexington, Kentucky, at the University of Kentucky. Previously, he held several positions at American University. Dr. Young, we're talking about violence, and you have written on this extensively. One of your books is Tortured Logic: Why Some Americans Support the Use of Torture and Counterterrorism. What was the thrust of that book?
Well, the thrust of that book connects with some of the bigger points that I try and make, both in teaching as well as in my research, but that violence is a process, and it tends to be something that someone starts and then becomes autocatalytic, meaning, one group does something violent and the other does another violent thing in response, and it keeps going. So one of the issues that got me thinking about this book, there was a general who's since passed away, but a general out in California who asked, and maybe you and I both maybe remember this, but maybe some of the younger viewers in our audience don't remember the show 24, which was a TV show that had this Kiefer Sutherland, and it had this protagonist named Jack Bauer, who would go out and try and find potential terrorists and do all the things he needed to do to catch them, and usually that involved torturing them to get information. And so I was watching the show one time, and I thought to myself, does this influence people? Does this change their beliefs about whether we should be torturing or not torturing? And then I read this clip by a general, and the general said, I'm concerned about this TV show because our troops are all watching it, and I'm worried that it makes them think that torture is an effective tool and that we should be doing it in the field. So my co-author and I, Aaron Carnes, we both thought, well, this is something we could test and figure out. And so we did some experiments where we showed people in different video clips, and they're actually 24 clips. In one clip, we show them torture being effective and eliciting the information that people want. And then when we doctored another clip and then showed torture not working. And when you show torture being effective, it really changes people's views. And so, part of the point of the book and, what our larger research program is to say, we have to be careful about what we promote and what we show, because it can influence people's beliefs. And not only, like your and my belief, but people who are on the front lines of these things, who are dealing with violent actors all the time. And if they go, I think Jack Bauer did this and it was effective, I'm going to do it. That's a troubling thing. And so, that was one of the big takeaways.
Mm-hmm. As I recall, I believe the Department of Defense has a mandate against torture. But when I think back to March of 2003, when President George W. Bush launched what now has been proven to be an illegal invasion of a sovereign country, namely Iraq, that the American troops really went into torture in a big way. And of course, this was transmitted around the Arab world. It was transmitted all around the world. And a lot of people believe that some of the most hardened fighters, some of the most people violently opposed to the United States and to many European countries, came out of watching this particular activity. But I recall that there was a guy named Dr. John Yoo, I believe, Yo or YOO, and of course, Paul Wolfowitz with the Department of Defense and some of the other neocons who created this whole scenario to illegally invade Iraq, ostensibly to get the oil, which didn't work out very well for them. And of course, a lot of people believe that's what really set off the powder keg of violence in many areas of the Middle East. How do you see that?
Well, I definitely, kind of going back to the point I was making earlier, I think violence is a cycle. And, when we went into Iraq, whether one supported the action or not, a big mistake we made was we put a bunch of young troops in charge of potentially hardened criminals, and we put them in a really difficult position. And similar to, for those of the viewers that know the Stanford prison experiment, we essentially in Abu Ghraib created the Stanford prison experiment. And any of us academics who are aware of that kind of, what that's about would go, well, this is ripe for just creating abuse, and which is exactly what it did. I don't think abuse was necessarily a policy, although you're right, John Yoo and Rumsfeld and others were not shy in supporting it. But I think one of the major factors was we just put people in really bad situations, asking them to get information quickly, who weren't trained, who were being shelled and their lives were at danger, and then said, get us this information quickly. So that's a recipe for people doing horrible things to other people. And then we realize a lot of the people that we detained aren't really bad people, but yet we've tortured them, and then we let them go. And so it's creating a bunch of distrust and a dislike for the U.S. and then you're training people how to be violent, and how to be specialists in violence. And so it was a bad cocktail all around.
It certainly was, and one we're dealing with today. We can't get away from it, that's for sure. Well, there are so many other areas we could talk about. One, of course, is Ukraine, and I guess the Russian invasion took place, golly, a little over 2 years ago now, and we see that there's been an immense amount of violence. How do you view that invasion, which I view as illegal, and the United Nations views it as illegal? Most of the countries of the world do. How do you view that? And also in relation to who's supporting Russia right now? Apparently China, North Korea, and a few other countries, not many, but they're bringing in foreign fighters to help. How do you put that into perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any doubt in, as you mentioned, in our minds that was an illegal invasion. Russia has shown in Georgia and other places that it has visions of being a global superpower again. And as children of the Cold War, we remember that's usually not a very good thing for the international system. I think there are obviously pieces of the U.S. vision of the globe that are suspect, and things that we wished we would have done differently. But I think a liberal international order is generally better for the world. And some people will definitely disagree with me on that, and that's okay. But the vision of an authoritarian order headed by Russia, supported by China, that to me is a very troubling international order. And it is a world where democracy is not a value, human rights aren't a value, and certainly Russia. What we're seeing in Ukraine is, yes, they're flaunting the law. They're flaunting all kinds of laws, including every sort of major law of war. And they're just, because they're a larger country with a bigger military, they're just doing an attrition strategy and just grinding down the Ukrainians. And the rest of the world has decided to sort of stay out of it. I mean, there are places that are arming the Ukrainians, but it could get to a place where this could lead to a larger global conflict, and that is going to draw the US, UN, Europe, and everybody else in, because Russia being in charge of Ukraine is just not, it's not a palatable outcome.
No, it isn't. And of course, Vladimir Putin, reportedly, he thought that he could roll in and he'd be in Kiev in a matter, excuse me, in a matter of days. But President Joe Biden, he mobilized NATO and many other countries to pull together and to support Ukraine. It's been remarkable that the Ukrainians have held on and done as well as they have, isn't it? I mean, against the power, Russia was feared. Well, many of us thought Russia probably had about the third or fourth largest military force in the world. And I'm not too sure that's the case as we look at Ukraine.
Well, it probably is the case, but what's interesting, and this is part of the rot of authoritarian regimes, and there's a great podcast on this. I won't necessarily plug it, but I listen to it regularly, about kind of Russian military preparedness. And before the war, the way things were operating, with Putin would, straight from the Kremlin, ask certain units within the Russian military, "Are you prepared? What's going on?" If they weren't prepared, they were punished. If they were prepared, then they gave them some type of benefit. Well, it was just cheap talk. It wasn't actually knowing whether they were prepared or not. And so what the invasion revealed was, yes, they have a fairly large conventional army, but it's not prepared. It's not well equipped. It's not well trained. And even, it's taken them 2 years to make the inroads that they're making in Ukraine. And it through a general attrition strategy, but kind of at every level, both at the tactical level and the larger strategic level, they've been really poor. And if, Ukraine, and this is true of most countries defending themselves, they have an advantage because they know the terrain. They're also fighting, for what Sun Tzu called, they're fighting on death ground. There's no retreat for Ukraine, right? This is their home, and so they're going to fight to the death. But unfortunately, that means they're kind of playing into Russia's strategy, and ideally, I think I understand why the rest of the world isn't directly getting involved in the conflict, but if it is a place where the Ukrainian regime starts to fall, we probably are going to have to.
Exactly, that's very true. And of course, as we look at what's going on as far as support for Ukraine, the UN Security Council has been somewhat paralyzed because Russia has the veto. But you've got UN agencies like the World Food Program, the High Commission for Refugees, are all on the ground in harm's way in Russia, in Ukraine, helping the Ukrainians stay alive. But doesn't this point to how important it is to have allies, to have people who are going to work with us to deal with these problems?
It's crucial. The rest of the kind of liberal international order needs to say this is a threat to the entire system. And thankfully, Russia has been turned into an international pariah, right? There are no Russian folks at the Olympics. They're sort of kept out of all the major conversations. And so, there are some shunning benefits that have been going on. And as you noted earlier in your original question, is there are foreign fighters coming to help Russia, but there are also foreign fighters going to Ukraine to support the Ukrainian Foreign Legion. And some of those are Americans, some of them are Canadians, some are Brazilians. I've interviewed a couple dozen of them, and to sort of understand why they're doing what they're doing. Most of the foreign fighters on the Russian side are more like mercenaries. They're paid to be part of it, where the folks joining the Ukrainian Foreign Legion are people trying to, in some cases, support the liberal international order and see Russia as a massive threat to it.
They certainly are. And excuse me, in our last 30 seconds, what do you recommend to our viewers to help us better understand these issues and to get involved, perhaps?
Oh, wow. I think reading diverse news sources, watching diverse news programs, try not to stay in one particular space, whether that's in the left or far right or whatever it is. Take in lots of different information and have conversations with people and try not to get stuck in one kind of echo chamber.
Exactly. That's words to the wise, and we all need to do that. But Dr. Joe Young, I want to thank you. Well, first off, welcome you to the University of Kentucky, to the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce, and to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
My pleasure. I am Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.